The cold hit her first. Not the kind of cold that sneaks up on a person gradually, the way autumn slides into winter with a polite warning. This was the kind of cold that had teeth, that gnawed through wool blankets and canvas wagon covers and burrowed straight into bone. Inez Chandler had not felt her fingers in at least 2 hours, and somewhere in the back of her half-frozen mind, she understood that this was a problem she was no longer equipped to solve on her own. She had not planned to fall asleep. She had told herself, as the sun dropped behind the San Jacinto Ridge and painted the Arizona sky in shades of blood and bruise, that she would keep moving. She had told herself that the next town could not be more than 8 miles out, that her old mare Dolly still had enough spirit left in her legs to close that distance before full dark. She had been wrong on both counts. Now the wagon sat still on a rutted trail that may or may not have been the road she thought she was following, Dolly standing patiently in the traces with her breath making small white clouds in the frozen air, and Inez was wrapped in every piece of fabric she owned, curled against the hard wagon bench like a question mark, and she was sleeping the dangerous, heavy sleep of someone whose body had stopped fighting and started surrendering. She did not hear the hoofbeats. She did not hear the creak of leather or the jingle of a bridle, did not hear the low voice that said, "Easy now," to a dark horse that snorted and stamped in the road. She did not feel the warmth of the lantern that swung close to her face, or see the way the light caught the silver badge pinned to a broad chest, or register the sharp intake of breath from the man who stood in the road beside her wagon, looking up at a woman he had never seen before, alone and still and frighteningly pale. What she did feel, cutting through the fog of cold and exhaustion like a brand against skin, was a hand on her shoulder, firm, warm, insistent. "Ma'am, nothing. Ma'am, wake up." Her eyelids weighed approximately as much as the wagon she was sleeping in. "Hey." The voice dropped lower, quieter, and something in the tone changed. The urgency was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded almost like fear. "Come on now, open your eyes." Inez Chandler opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the lantern, burning amber and gold in the blue-black dark. The second thing she saw was a face looking down at her with an expression she could not immediately identify because her brain was still working at about a quarter of its usual speed. It was a serious face, a weathered face, dark eyes that caught the lantern light and held it. She blinked. He said, "You are coming inside where it is warm." It was not a question. It was not entirely a command either, though it had the authority of one. It landed somewhere between those two things, in that particular territory occupied by people who are accustomed to making decisions in emergencies and have learned that the time for politeness is after the crisis has passed. Inez Chandler, who had survived more crises in the past 18 months than most women saw in a lifetime, who had crossed 3 state lines and burned 1 bridge behind her for every mile she traveled, who was wanted for something she had not done and running from someone she had trusted and been betrayed by completely, opened her mouth and said the only thing her frozen brain could manage. "Who are you?" The man with the lantern and the serious face and the silver badge said, "Edwin Malone. I'm the sheriff of Red Rock Crossing." He paused, and she could see him assessing her, cataloging her condition with the practiced eye of someone who had seen trouble in many forms. "And right now I'm the man who's telling you that you will freeze to death out here before morning if you don't come inside." She looked at the badge. She looked at the dark town behind him, a cluster of lit windows and a church steeple that cut a black silhouette against the stars. She thought about the paper folded in the inner pocket of her coat, the paper with her name on it, and the words "Wanted for Fraud" printed in block letters above a likeness that looked enough like her to be dangerous. She thought about warmth. She said, "All right." 6 weeks earlier, Inez Chandler had been a respected bookkeeper in the town of Haskell, Texas, which sat on the edge of the staked plains and smelled constantly of cattle and red dust. She had been, in the particular vocabulary of 1882, a woman of good character and modest means, which was another way of saying she was smart enough to be useful and poor enough to be overlooked. She had worked for a man named Douglas Pratt, who owned the largest mercantile operation in Callahan County, and had the sort of smile that made people trust him before they'd had time to think about whether they ought to. Pratt had hired her 2 years ago when her father died and left her with nothing but the house and the debt against it, and she had been grateful. That gratitude, she now understood, had been the first of her mistakes. The second mistake had been being good at her job. Because when you were good with numbers, when you noticed things that didn't add up, when you kept careful records and compared them against previous records, and found that large sums of money had been moving in directions that had nothing to do with legitimate commerce, you became inconvenient. And Douglas Pratt had a very specific way of dealing with inconvenient people. He had her arrested. The charge was fraud. The story he told was that Inez Chandler had been skimming from the accounts for months, a steady and clever theft that only his own vigilance had uncovered. He produced paperwork that bore her signature, paperwork she had never seen before in her life, and he stood in the sheriff's office in Haskell with his hat in his hand and his voice heavy with reluctant sorrow, and said that he wished it weren't true, that he had thought of her almost as a daughter, that he was devastated to have been so thoroughly deceived. The sheriff of Haskell had known Douglas Pratt for 30 years. He had known Inez Chandler for 2. The arithmetic of loyalty was not complicated. She had spent one night in the jail cell before someone left the door open. She had never found out who. She suspected it was the deputy, a young man named Samuel Forrest, who had looked at her with an expression of deep discomfort every time he brought her meals, as if he was trying to decide something. She had not stayed long enough to ask him. She had taken the wagon that belonged to her father, loaded it with what she could carry in an hour of frantic, silent work in the dark, hitched Dolly to the traces, and driven west. She had no particular destination. She had only the direction and the desperate, clarifying logic of someone who has nothing left to protect except herself. She had been driving for 6 weeks. She had worked when she could, taking in laundry or helping with accounts in small towns where nobody had seen the wanted circular yet. She had been careful. She had been smart. She had been in the Arizona Territory in December of 1882, extraordinarily, catastrophically unlucky about the weather. The inside of the Raydrock Crossing Sheriff's Office was warm in the way that only a place with a serious wood-burning stove in its center can be warm. The heat came out in waves that Inez could feel against her face and her hands even before she had fully crossed the threshold, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment just to absorb it, the way a dry creek bed absorbs the first rain. Edwin Malone had taken her mare around to the stable behind the jail, had seen to the horse before he saw to her, which she noted and found telling. A man who cared for animals kept his word. Her father had told her that. She was not sure it was always true, but it was a better indicator than most. She stood in front of the stove with her hands out and felt the sensation come back into her fingers in stages, first as pain, which was actually a relief because pain meant the nerves were still working, then as tingling, then gradually as warmth. She was still standing like that when the door opened and Edwin Malone came back inside with a gust of cold air that made her flinch. He stopped when he saw her. He had a look on his face that was not quite an expression, more like the absence of one, the careful blankness of a man who has learned to keep his reactions off his face. But his eyes moved over her in a way that was not clinical and not intrusive. It was more like concern that had not yet found the right shape to take. "There's coffee," he said. "Thank you." He poured it into a tin cup and handed it to her, and she wrapped both hands around it and drank it before it had fully cooled because she wanted the heat inside her as much as outside. It was strong, the kind of coffee that had been sitting on the stove since some time that afternoon, and it tasted like salvation. Edwin Malone sat down behind his desk. He did not immediately start asking questions, which surprised her. He just sat there with his own cup of coffee and looked at the surface of his desk, and she had time to look at him properly for the first time. He was, she estimated, somewhere around 30. He was tall, She had gathered that much from when he stood beside the wagon, and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of genuine physical work rather than simple size. He had dark hair that was a little too long to be tidy, and the kind of jaw that suggested he did not spend much time worrying about what people thought of his appearance. The badge on his coat was polished, though. She noticed that. Everything else about him had the look of a man who was practical first and concerned with presentation second, except for that badge, which was clean and bright. "How long were you on the road?" he asked finally. "Since early this morning." "Coming from where?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but he caught it. She saw his eyes lift from the desk to her face, and the quality of his attention sharpened. "Tucson," she said, which was the last substantial town she had passed through and was true as far as it went. "Where are you headed?" Another hesitation. "I'm not entirely certain." He looked at her for a long moment. "What's your name?" And here it was. The moment she had been dreading since the second she saw the badge on his chest. She had spent 6 weeks learning to lie, and she was still not good at it. Because lying required a kind of self-certainty she had never been good at faking. She was good at accuracy, she was good at precision. Lying was an imprecise art. "Inez," she said. "Inez Harper." She used her mother's maiden name because it was the first thing that came to her and because she was too tired to be more creative than that. Edwin Malone wrote it down on a piece of paper on his desk. "Where's your family, Miss Harper?" "I don't have any." He looked up again. "Anyone waiting for you somewhere?" "No." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "There's a room in the back. Used to be where the deputy slept before I lost my deputy to a cattle operation, paying 3 times the wage I can offer. It's got a bed and a blanket and a stove vent that keeps it warm enough. You're welcome to it tonight." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because it's December and it's 30 degrees outside and you were half frozen in your wagon." He said it simply, as if the logic were self-evident, as if there were no other possible answer to the question. "You don't know anything about me. I know you need a warm place to sleep." He stood up and took the lantern from his desk. "I'm not going to ask you questions you don't want to answer tonight. We can talk in the morning." She followed him down the short hallway to a door that opened onto a small room, plain and functional, with a narrow iron-framed bed and 2 wool blankets and a window that looked out onto the dark main street of Redrock Crossing. It was, without question, the most welcome sight she had seen in 6 weeks. She turned to thank him and found that he was already moving back toward the main office, giving her privacy without being asked. "Sheriff," she said. He stopped, turned. "Why do you do this, for strangers?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the lamplight she could see something move across his face, something that lived underneath the careful blankness. Something that had its own history and its own particular weight. "Because," he said, "someone should have done it for my mother and nobody did." He closed the door, and Inez Chandler sat down on the narrow bed in the warm little room and pressed her forehead to her knees and breathed. Just breathed. It was the first time in 6 weeks she had felt safe enough to do that, to just be still and breathe, and she did not know what to do with the feeling, so she simply sat with it until she fell asleep. Redrock Crossing was a town that had survived 2 decades of the violence and chaos that characterized Arizona Territory in the period of its growth, and it bore the marks of that survival the way an old soldier bears scars. The buildings on the main street were a mix of adobe and timber, permanent and improvised, with the particular character of places that had been built in a hurry, and then improved slowly as people decided to stay. There was a general store, a livery stable, a barber, a land office, a church made of whitewashed adobe, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that was considerably louder than everything else at all hours of the day. Edwin Malone had been the sheriff of Redrock Crossing for 4 years, appointed by the county commission after the previous sheriff retired to his daughter's farm in New Mexico Territory. He had come to the job from Pima County, where he had spent 3 years as a deputy under a man named Cutter who had taught him that authority without judgment was just a faster way to make enemies. Malone had taken that lesson seriously. He applied it every day. He was, by the reckoning of most of the people in Redrock Crossing, a good sheriff. Fair, not easily rattled, thorough without being petty. He had the respect of the business owners on the main street and the grudging acceptance of the cowboys who came through with the cattle drives, which was about as good as any lawman in the territory could reasonably hope for. He was also, by his own reckoning, profoundly alone. This was not a fact he dwelt on. He was not a man who spent much time in the company of self-pity, but it was true in a plain and unadorned way, the way that a room with nothing in it is empty. He had no family within 300 miles. He had colleagues and acquaintances, and people who nodded to him on the street, but he had nobody who asked how he was and waited for the actual answer. He had the sheriff's office, with its stove and its desk and its empty deputy's room, and he had his horse, a gray gelding named Consequence, and he had the work, which was enough to fill the days without being quite enough to fill everything else. He had not been looking for anything to change that. He was not, in his experience, the kind of man who was lucky in that particular department, and he had long since made a private peace with that understanding. And then there was the woman in the wagon. He could not have explained, if asked, why she stayed in his mind through the night after he gave her the deputy's room. He sat at his desk for another hour after she was settled, working through the week's paperwork, and he caught himself thinking about her 3 separate times. About the way she had looked when she first opened her eyes, the particular quality of her confusion, not afraid exactly, but intensely, carefully alert, as if even half frozen she was assessing the situation. About the way she had said, "Who are you?" Not as a frightened question, but as a direct one, as if the answer mattered and she intended to evaluate it honestly. About the way she had hesitated before she gave her name. He had been a lawman long enough to recognize a hesitation like that. It was not the pause of someone trying to remember something. It was the pause of someone deciding something. He filed that away, not with suspicion exactly, but with the professional habit of noting details that didn't quite fit. In the morning, he made eggs and bacon on the small stove in the jail kitchen and coffee that was considerably fresher than the night before's, and he set a plate on the desk and knocked on the door of the deputy's room. Inez Chandler came out looking considerably better than she had the night before, which was to say she looked like a live person rather than a woman in the late stages of an argument with death. She had combed her hair and washed her face with the water he had left outside the door, and in the daylight coming through the front windows of the office he could see that she had dark eyes, very dark, and a face that was not conventionally pretty in the way that frontier towns used the word, not soft or decorative but striking, the kind of face that had something behind it. She sat down across from him and ate, and for a while neither of them said anything, which he found unexpectedly comfortable. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked eventually. She looked up from her plate. "Since November. That's a long time to travel alone in winter." "I didn't have the option of waiting for better weather." He noted the phrasing. "What kind of work do you do?" Something shifted in her expression then, not fear, more like recognition. "Bookkeeping, accounts. I worked as a bookkeeper for 2 years before I left Texas." "Texas," he said. "Yes." "Whereabouts?" A pause. "West Texas, small town, you wouldn't know it." He thought about pushing, decided against it. "There's no bookkeeping work in Red Rock Crossing at present. The land office handles its own accounts, such as they are. But Gareth Sull at the general store has been complaining for months that he can't make heads or tails of his own ledgers." He watched her. "If you were looking for work," she looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Why would you help me find work?" "Same reason I told you to come inside last night," he said. "It's practical." She ate in silence for a moment, then quietly, "I may not be able to stay long." "That's your business," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay or to go. I'm just saying the option is there if you want it." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite trust, but was the shape that trust takes when it's just beginning to consider whether the door is safe to open. She said, "I'll think about it." Gareth Sull was a large, good-natured man from Ohio, who had come west with ambitions that exceeded his organizational abilities, and his general store reflected this gap in a very physical way. The back room contained 3 years' worth of mixed receipts, a ledger system that appeared to be based on no discernible logic, and several boxes of records that had been shuffled together in what Sull cheerfully described as a system of creative arrangement. Inez stood in the doorway of that back room on the morning of her second day in Redrock Crossing and looked at it with the calm, focused attention of a person who has found something they are genuinely good at, and said, "This will take approximately 2 weeks." Sull looked relieved enough to weep. "Can you start today?" She started immediately. She organized, sorted, cross-referenced, and reconstructed a coherent account of Sull's finances for the preceding 3 years, and she did it with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom numbers were a native language. By the end of the first week, she had not only made sense of the chaos, but had identified 3 ongoing supplier relationships that were costing Sull considerably more than they needed to. Sull paid her a fair wage, offered her meals at the store's back table, and within 4 days had started referring to her as Miss Harper, the best thing that's happened to this business since indoor plumbing, which in the particular context of Redrock Crossing in 1882 was intended as a serious compliment. She stayed in the small room behind the jail. Edwin Malone told himself this was simply practical. The room was empty. The town had no hotel, only the Copper Kettle's pair of rooms upstairs, which were not appropriate for a woman traveling alone. He told himself he would have done the same for anyone, which was true, and then told himself there was no particular reason the arrangement should make him any more aware of what time it was in the evenings than he had been before, which was less true. She brought coffee to his office in the mornings. She did not announce this as a policy, simply appeared one morning with 2 cups and set one on his desk and took the other for herself and sat in the chair across from him and said, "Tell me about this town." So he did. He told her about Redrock Crossing in the straightforward way he did most things, without editorializing or exaggerating, describing the town's history and its characters and its particular geography, the red sandstone formations that gave it its name, the river 2 miles east that ran year-round, the mines in the hills that had started the whole thing 20 years ago and were still producing enough to keep the town breathing. She listened with what he came to recognize as her characteristic quality of attention, which was total and active, and gave the impression that she was not just hearing but filing, organizing, connecting. She asked good questions. She remembered everything he told her. He started to look forward to the mornings. This was, he told himself, simply because he was a man who had been without conversation for a long time, which was also true. But there was a moment at the end of the second week when she was sitting across from him in the morning and laughing at something he had said, some story about the Copper Kettle's owner and a dispute over a game of dominoes that had gotten considerably out of hand, and the sound of her laughing hit him somewhere in the chest with the same quality as the warmth from the stove, spreading out and filling a space he had stopped noticing was cold. He looked away. He drank his coffee. He told himself to be sensible. She had a secret. He was aware of this with the same professional certainty that told him when a man at the bar was carrying a gun under his coat. The hesitation over her name, the careful vagueness about where she had come from, the way she sometimes stopped what she was doing and looked out the window with an expression that was equal parts vigilance and exhaustion, as if she was waiting for something to appear that she very much did not want to see. He did not ask. He told himself this was because it was her right to have a private history, which was true. He also did not entirely want to know, because he was beginning to understand that knowing might force him to act in ways he did not want to act, and this was the first time in 4 years he had been reluctant about his own professional obligations, which was itself a piece of information he did not know what to do with. The problem resolved itself, as problems in small towns tend to do, with the arrival of mail. The weekly mail came from Tucson on the back of the stage line, brought by a driver named Hollies, who delivered it to the post office, with the particular combination of indifference and efficiency that marked all the stage drivers Malone had known. Tucson also sent, on a reasonably regular basis, a packet of wanted circulars and law enforcement bulletins that Malone reviewed and filed and occasionally acted upon. He was sitting at his desk on the Thursday evening of Inez's third week in Red Rock Crossing when he opened the bulletin packet and unfolded the circulars one by one, and the fourth one showed a face that he recognized. He sat with it for a long moment. The drawing was not perfectly accurate, which was true of most wanted circulars, the artists who made them working from descriptions rather than direct observation. But it caught something essential in the face, the particular line of the jaw, the directness of the eyes. The name printed beneath it was Inez Chandler. The charge was fraud. The issuing county was Callahan, Texas. He read the description carefully. Female, dark hair, dark eyes, approximately 5 feet and 4 inches, age approximately 26. Last seen traveling west in a covered wagon. One horse, bay, possibly lame. He set the circular down on his desk. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the wall. She was in the back room. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of her moving around, the small domestic sounds that had become in 3 weeks a kind of background music he had gotten used to without noticing it happening. He picked the circular back up. He read it again. He noticed, because he was thorough, several things. The charge was fraud, not violent crime. There were no details of the alleged crime included, only the charge. The issuing authority was the Callahan County Sheriff's Office, acting on the complaint of a Douglas Pratt, merchant, Haskell, Texas. He had been in law enforcement for 7 years. He had seen a great many wanted circulars, and he had learned to read what they said and also what they did not say. This one did not say what the fraud consisted of, which was not standard. Fraud circulars usually specified the nature of the scheme. This one only had the charge and the name and the description and the issuer. He thought about the way she had hesitated before she gave a name. He thought about the way she organized numbers with the total confidence of someone who was not just competent but genuinely at home in them. He thought about a woman who kept meticulous books, who noticed discrepancies, who worked for a merchant. He was not stupid. He sat at his desk for a long time that evening, and the decision he reached was not the one that a strictly procedural reading of his duty would have demanded. It was the decision of a man who had learned, under a mentor named Cutter, that authority without judgment was just a faster way to make enemies, and that judgment meant taking the time to understand what you were actually looking at before you acted on it. He knocked on the door of the back room. She opened it, and she had her hair down because she had been about to sleep, and the sight of her with her hair loose and her face unguarded gave him a flash of that particular feeling that he was getting better at not showing. He held up the circular. She looked at it, and then she did something he had not expected. She did not run, did not deny, did not try to find a story that would fit over the truth. She looked at the circular for a long moment and then looked at him, and her face settled into an expression that was very tired and very honest. "I didn't do it," she said. "Tell me what happened," he said. So she did. She told him about Douglas Pratt and the accounts that did not add up. She told him about the documents she found and the questions she started asking. She told him about the arrest and the forged signatures, and the night the jail cell door swung open and she ran. She told it plainly and directly without embellishment, and she did not cry, though he could see that the telling cost her something. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove any of it?" he asked. "Not from here. My records are in Haskell, but I had copies. I keep copies of everything." She crossed to the carpetbag in the corner of the room and reached inside and produced a folded packet of papers, and she handed them to him. He took them to his desk and read them, all of them. He was not an accountant, but he had been dealing with records of various kinds for 7 years, and he was competent enough to see what she was showing him. The numbers she had copied out did not correspond to any legitimate business pattern he could identify. They corresponded, quite clearly, to someone moving money in ways that needed to be concealed. He set the papers down. He looked at her, standing in the doorway of the back room with her arms folded against her chest and her chin up, waiting for whatever came next with the kind of courage that is not the absence of fear but the presence of something stronger. He said, "I'm not arresting you." Her arms dropped slightly, just slightly. "But," he continued, "I am going to write a letter to the county commission in Callahan, and I'm going to write another one to the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson." He looked at her steadily. "You stay here while this gets sorted. You keep working for Saul, you don't run." "Why would you do that?" she asked, and the question was the same one she had asked that first morning over eggs and coffee, but it had more weight in it now. He considered the honest answer, which was several things layered together and not all of them strictly professional. He gave her the one that was most defensible. "Because I've seen what happens when a woman with no resources runs from a charge she can't fight from the road. She spends the rest of her life running, and eventually she loses." He paused. "And because the evidence you've brought me is more consistent with your account than with his." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "All right." "All right," he agreed. "Get some sleep." He sat at his desk until past midnight writing the letters. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular kind of tension. The tension of waiting for distant machinery to turn, of knowing that somewhere across the territory paperwork was moving from desk to desk, that decisions were being made by people who had no particular investment in the outcome, that justice in 1882 was a slow and imprecise mechanism that did not always arrive at the right result even when it was trying. Inez continued working at Saul's store. She finished the accounting project and Saul, not wanting to lose her, hired her on a continuing basis to maintain the books and manage correspondence with suppliers. She was good at the work, visibly good, and the small community of Red Rock Crossing noticed this with the frank practical appreciation of people who know competence when they see it. She became, over those weeks, a part of the town's daily life in a gradual and unforced way. She knew the names of the people who came into Saul's store. She knew which of the ranchers' wives was having trouble with a difficult pregnancy, and which of the miners' families needed a bit of credit extended without public comment. She was not warm in a demonstrative way, was not given to easy chatter or social performance, but she was present and she was paying attention, and people felt it. Edwin Malone watched all of this with a care he told himself was professional concern, and which he was aware, with increasing frankness, was something else entirely. He watched the way she moved through the store with her ledger under her arm. He watched the way she talked to the ranchers' wives, direct and practical and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way that he had come to find unexpectedly delightful. He watched the way she sometimes stood outside Saul's in the early evening and looked at the mountains to the west with an expression that was private and searching, and he wondered what she was looking for and whether he was ever going to be brave enough to ask. He was not, he told himself, a man who got to have this kind of thing. He was a sheriff in a small Arizona town, with a salary that barely covered his own expenses, and a past that had a few dark corners of its own. He was not the kind of man who deserved to look at a woman like Inez Chandler and think about anything beyond his professional obligations. He thought about her anyway. She brought the coffee every morning. They talked, and the talking expanded and deepened over those 3 weeks in the way that conversations between intelligent people who are paying attention to each other tend to do. They talked about books, and he was surprised by the range of what she had read, carrying a small collection in her wagon that she had prioritized over heavier practical goods. They talked about the territory and its politics, and the ongoing question of what statehood might mean for places like Red Rock Crossing. They talked about the injustices that were visible everywhere in the territory, the way Apache families were being pushed from land they had lived on for generations, the way the law protected some people more thoroughly than others, the way a woman with no family and no resources had almost no recourse when powerful men decided to use the system against her. He listened to her talk about these things with a quality of attention that was not just interest, it was recognition. She thought about the world in a way that matched something in the way he thought about it, some underlying framework of what mattered and what was wrong and what was worth trying to do about it. He did not tell her any of this. He kept it carefully interior, but he was aware that something was happening to him, something that had the quality of inevitability, the way a river moves toward the sea, steady and unhurried and entirely impossible to redirect. The reply from the U.S. Marshal's office came on a Wednesday morning in the third week of January. He read it at his desk with Inez sitting across from him, and he could see her watching his face, trying to read the outcome from his expression before he spoke. He kept his face neutral through the reading, which required some effort, and when he was done, he set it down and looked at her. "They're opening an investigation into Douglas Pratt," he said. She was very still. "The Marshal's office has been watching Pratt for some time, it seems. For a different matter, fraud connected to a land deal in Abilene 2 years ago. Your evidence fits a pattern they've already identified." He watched her absorb this. "The want circular against you is being suspended pending the investigation. You're not going to be arrested, Inez." He had not until that moment used her first name. He heard it as it left his mouth and saw her hear it, saw the small flicker of awareness in her expression. She looked at the letter on the desk, she looked at him, and then very quietly she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right. My name is not Harper, it's Chandler, Inez Chandler." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "The circular had your real name," he said. "I've known since the night I showed it to you. And you used it just now on purpose," she said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression, something that had been held tight and braced against impact, and it released, and she looked, for the first time since he had known her, genuinely unguarded. She said, "Thank you, Edwin." He had a response to that which he did not give, because the morning was not the time and the office was not the place, and he was still, fundamentally, a man who took things seriously and did not rush headlong into territory without knowing the ground. He said, "You're welcome, Inez," and drank his coffee. The Saturday evening after the letter from the Marshal's office arrived was the occasion of Redrock Crossing's bi-monthly social gathering, held in the church hall and organized by the minister's wife, a formidable woman named Margaret Oates, who applied the same administrative energy to community recreation that Inez applied to accounting, with similarly impressive results. The hall was lit with lanterns, and the stove was burning high, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar, and the gathered people of Redrock Crossing were dancing the schottische and the square dance, and the Virginia reel, with the particular joy of people who work hard and live in a place that doesn't offer much entertainment, for whom a Saturday social is not a minor pleasure but a genuine event. Edwin Malone stood near the wall with a cup of punch. He was not particularly drinking, and watched the floor with the expression of a man who is present at a party without being of it. He had come because Margaret Oates had asked him directly, and declining her direct requests was not something most people in Redrock Crossing were foolish enough to do. He was wearing a clean shirt and had made some efforts with his hair and had put on the boots that he reserved for occasions, and he was, by any reasonable assessment, the most stationary person in the room. Inez appeared at his elbow. She was wearing a green dress that he had not seen before, which meant she had been wearing it in the wagon and had kept it for something, and her hair was pinned up with a care that was slightly different from her usual practical arrangement. She looked, he thought with the careful honesty of a man trying to be fair to himself, extraordinary. She came to stand beside him at the wall and looked at the dancing floor with an expression that matched his, the expression of someone who is watching rather than participating. "You're not dancing," she said. "No. Do you dance?" "I know how," he said. "It's not quite the same thing." She laughed, short and genuine, and the sound of it hit him in the same place it always did. "That's either very honest or very evasive, and I can't decide which." "Both," he said. She looked at the dancers for a moment. Then she said, "Edwin." "Yes. Thank you for everything you've done." She said it differently from the morning in the office, not as acknowledgement but as something more weighted, more deliberate. You didn't have to fight for me. You had the circular and you had cause to act on it and you chose not to, and then you chose to do something active and useful on my behalf, and I want you to know that I understand what that cost you, professionally and otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. It didn't cost me as much as you think. Why not? He looked at her. The lantern light was warm on her face and she was looking up at him with those very dark eyes that were direct in the way all of her was direct, that did not look away or hedge or pretend not to want the honest answer. He said, "Because everything I did for you I would have done again." She held his gaze. "That's not a complete answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not," she said quietly. "Edwin." He said, "Inez." And they stood there at the wall of the church hall in Red Rock Crossing, Arizona Territory in the winter of 1882, while the fiddle played and the dancers turned, and something that had been building between them with the steady patience of a river reached a point where it could not be managed or redirected or politely ignored any longer. He said, "Would you dance with me?" She said, "I thought you said you know how, but you're not dancing." "I'm making an exception." She took his hand, and he led her onto the floor, and they danced the schottische with the other couples while the fiddle played something bright and quick. And he was aware with every part of him that was capable of being aware of the warmth of her hand in his, and the way she moved with the kind of natural grace that doesn't come from practice, but from some innate quality of being comfortable in one's own body. And the fact that she was smiling, actually smiling. Not the small, controlled smile she used in the store, or the dry, amused smile she used when he said something she found unexpectedly funny, but a full, open, delighted smile that transformed her entire face. He thought, "I am in serious trouble." He thought, "I don't mind at all." After the dancing, they walked back to the jail through the cold night air, their breath making clouds in the lantern light, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, neither of them adjusting the distance. The stars were extraordinary over the desert, thick and low and brilliant, and she looked up at them with the particular reverence of someone who has spent enough time outdoors to know the sky well. "I grew up in a town," she said. "A real town with gas lights on the main street. You couldn't see stars like this." "The territory has its qualities," he agreed. "Do you like it here?" she asked, genuinely. "Yes," he said, and he meant it. "It's hard and it's isolated and there's not much that's comfortable about it, but it's honest. The difficulty is real and the beauty is real and nothing is pretending to be something it isn't." She looked at him. "Is that what you value, honesty, more than most things?" She stopped walking. They were in the middle of the dark main street, and the only light was the lantern he was carrying and the stars overhead, and she turned to face him with an expression that was very serious and very open. "I should have told you who I was immediately," she said. "I know that. I was afraid." "I know why you were afraid," he said. "It was the right call under the circumstances. It was deception. It was survival," he said firmly. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a remarkable man, Edwin Malone." He felt the back of his neck warm in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'm a man who's trying to do his job." "That's not all you are," she said. He looked down at her. She was close enough that he could see the particular quality of her attention, all of it fixed on him with that total, active presence that made him feel more seen than he was used to, more than was entirely comfortable, more than he had known he wanted. He said, very quietly, "Inez." She said equally quietly, "Yes, I would very much like to kiss you." She was quiet for one breath and then she said, "I would very much like you too." So he did. It was cold and dark, and the main street of Red Rock Crossing was empty in the late winter night, and Edwin Malone kissed Inez Chandler with the careful, deliberate honesty with which he did everything, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to every other thing in her life. And for a moment the wind died and the stars burned overhead and the world reduced itself to this, just this, which was more than enough. When they broke apart, she looked up at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something soft and wondering that lived underneath the competence and the wariness and the careful self-containment. She said, "You should know that I have not been someone who trusts easily, particularly not recently." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm asking you to let me give you reason to, a little at a time." She looked at him. "That," she said, "is exactly the right thing to say." He smiled, and she saw it, and she looked startled, as if she had not fully realized until that moment that he had a smile that could do that to a face. He was not generally given to smiling without cause, but he had cause now, and it showed in a way that altered his whole expression and made him look, she thought, considerably younger and considerably more approachable and considerably more dangerous to the composure she had been working hard to maintain. She said, "Edwin." He said, "Inez." "We should go inside," she said. "It's very cold." "It is," he agreed. They walked the rest of the way to the jail in a silence that was entirely different from any silence that had come before between them, a silence that had warmth in it. February brought an investigation. Not the distant, epistolary investigation of the marshal's office in Tucson, but an actual person, a deputy U.S. Marshal named James Cray, who arrived on the Tuesday stage with a leather satchel and an efficient manner, and a letter of introduction from the marshal's office confirming the investigation of Douglas Pratt for multiple counts of fraud across 3 Texas counties. Cray was thorough and businesslike and not unfriendly, and he spent 3 days in Red Rock Crossing reviewing the copies of documents Inez had brought with her and asking her careful, systematic questions, and taking careful, systematic notes. And at the end of the 3 days, he told her that her evidence was consistent with a pattern of fraudulent financial manipulation that the marshal's office had been documenting for 18 months. He also told her, sitting across from her and Malone at the sheriff's desk, that Pratt had been arrested the previous week in Abilene, that the charges against him included the Callahan County fraud, the Abilene land fraud, and 2 additional counts that had emerged during the investigation, that the false warrant for her arrest had been formally withdrawn, that she was, in the legal language of the U.S. Marshal's office, exonerated. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "He forged my signature." "Yes," Cray said, "we have sufficient evidence to demonstrate that. And the money he moved through Pratt Mercantile is being reconstructed from accounts in 3 counties, Cray confirmed. "It's a substantial sum. I cannot tell you whether any of it will be recovered or whether the victims will see restitution. That is for the courts to determine. But I can tell you that your name is clear, Miss Chandler, and that Pratt is going to answer for what he did." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked at Malone. He was watching her with an expression she knew by now, the careful stillness of a man who is feeling something real and keeping it contained, and she could see through the surface of it to what was underneath, which was something that looked like it had been waiting a long time. She reached across the desk and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a moment while James Cray gathered his notes with the polite inattention of a professional. That evening, when Cray had gone to his room at the Copper Kettle, and the town had settled into its night routine, Inez and Edwin sat in the sheriff's office with the stove burning and the door to the street locked against the cold, and they talked for a very long time. She told him about her father, who had been a teacher and had taught her to love books and numbers with equal intensity, and who had died of a fever when she was 23 and left her with the house and the debt and the necessity of reinventing her life from scratch. She told him about working for Pratt, about the pride she had taken in the work and the sickening disillusionment of discovering what was underneath it. She told him about the night she ran, about the 6 weeks on the road, about the particular texture of the fear that had kept her company through all of it. He told her about his mother. He had been 12 when his father left, which was not unusual in frontier communities, but was in his case particularly consequential because his father had been the only income in the family, and his mother was left with 3 children and no resources and no family within 200 miles, in a small Kansas town that had no particular mechanism for helping women in her situation. He had watched her work herself to exhaustion trying to keep them fed, had watched the town extend charity that came with conditions and judgment attached, had watched her get sick in the third winter of that period from a combination of cold and malnutrition that she would not admit to until she could no longer walk. She had survived. She had eventually found work that was adequate to their needs and had raised all 3 children to adulthood. But the memory of that winter had stayed with Edwin Malone in a way that had shaped everything since: the career he chose, the way he practiced it, the instinct that had made him stop at a wagon on a cold December road and look inside and find a woman he could not in conscience leave there. "That's why you do it," Inez said. "You told me that first night. You said someone should have done it for your mother." "Yes," she looked at him. "You carry that with you." "Everyone carries something," he said. "That's true," she said quietly. "But some people carry it and let it make them bitter, and some people carry it and let it make them better." She paused. "You're the second kind." He looked at her with an expression that was very direct and entirely unguarded, and she thought it was perhaps the first time she had seen him completely without the professional layer, without the careful containment, just the man underneath. He said, "I want to say something to you." "Say it." "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I know you have a life that isn't here, and I know you've been running and you're only just finding your footing again, and I'm not going to ask you for anything you're not ready to give. But I want you to know where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment. "Where do you stand?" "I am," he said carefully, "more interested in your continued presence in my life than I have been in almost anything for a very long time. And that is an understatement," she said. "Edwin Malone. Inez Chandler. I want to tell you something in return." "All right," she said. "When you found me in that wagon, I had stopped believing that things were going to get better. I was cold and I was frightened and I was alone, and I had been alone for 6 weeks in a way that was beginning to feel like forever." She looked at her hands. "And you said you are coming inside where it is warm. And you said it like it was simply true, like there was no question about it, like warmth was something I was entitled to regardless of whatever trouble was following me." She looked up. "And that was the moment I started believing again that things could be different." He was very still. She said, "I don't want to leave either." The spring came to the Arizona territory with the particular extravagance of desert country, the whole landscape shifting from its winter severity into something blooming and vivid, the cacti flowering in shades of pink and yellow, the dry washes running with snowmelt from the mountains, the air smelling of dust and sweetness and possibility. Inez was still in Red Rock Crossing. She had moved from the deputy's room, eventually, into a boarding situation with the Oates family that was considerably more appropriate, and that Margaret Oates had arranged with the decisive pragmatism that characterized all her efforts. She continued working for Saul, who had come to regard her as essential to the operation of his business, and had on 2 occasions told other merchants' representatives from Tucson that she was not available for hire regardless of what they offered, with the particular territorial pride of a man who recognizes a good thing. She and Edwin saw each other every day, which in a town the size of Red Rock Crossing was not difficult to arrange. They had developed a routine: the morning coffee, the evening walk when the weather allowed, the Saturday social. And within the routine they had developed something that was not routine at all, something that grew steadily and without drama or crisis, fed by the 1,000 small exchanges of 2 people who are paying close attention to each other and finding, over and over again, that what they find is good. He was patient with her. She had told him she did not trust easily, and he took this seriously, not as a problem to be solved or a wall to be climbed, but as a truth to be honored, moving at a pace that gave her room to choose at every step. He was consistent in a way that mattered, present when he said he would be, honest when honesty was difficult, generous with his attention in the steady, unfussy way that was native to his character. She trusted him. It built in her like the river building toward flood stage, slowly and inevitably, until one morning in March she was sitting across from him in the office with her coffee, and she realized with a clarity that felt physical that she was not waiting for the other shoe to drop, was not cataloging his behaviors for signs of the betrayal that experience had taught her to expect. She was just sitting in a warm office drinking coffee with a man she trusted, and the simplicity of it was so profound that it made her breath catch. He noticed. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Then, something I'll tell you later." "All right," he said, because he had learned that her later always arrived. It arrived that evening during the walk along the east road toward the river, with the mountains turning gold in the last of the sunset light and the air carrying the smell of spring. She said, "I realized something this morning. Tell me." "I trust you completely," she said. "I realized I had stopped watching for you to fail me, and I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but it did, and I wanted you to know." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him, and he was looking at her with that expression she loved, the one that was completely without armor. He said, "Inez." "Yes, I love you." She had known it was coming, had felt it building in the weeks prior, had known in the abstract for some time that this was where they were headed, but hearing it still did something to her chest that she had not entirely anticipated. She said, "I love you too, Edwin." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair away from her face with a gentleness that was somehow more intimate than the kisses they had shared, and she reached up and put her hand over his and held it against her cheek for a moment. He said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were very bright in the evening light. She said, "Yes." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding his breath, this careful, composed man who kept his reactions off his face, and the small, visible vulnerability of it made her love him more fiercely than she had 5 seconds before. She said, "Yes, Edwin." "Obviously, yes." He smiled, that full, genuine smile that was still rare enough to be remarkable, and she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he folded her against his chest, and they stood at the edge of the east road with the mountains going dark behind them and the first stars appearing overhead, and the spring air smelling of everything coming to life again. Margaret Oates organized the wedding, naturally. She organized it with the same comprehensive efficiency she brought to everything else. And the result was a ceremony in the whitewashed adobe church in Red Rock Crossing on a Saturday morning in April that was attended by essentially everyone in town, plus a number of ranchers and their families from the surrounding countryside, who received word through the informal communication network of frontier communities, and turned up because events of this kind were rare and worth the ride. Gareth's soul cried, which he later denied with great conviction. The minister, a quiet man named Father Ambrose, performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he was genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. Edwin Malone stood at the front of the church in a good coat he had ordered from the tailor in Tucson 3 weeks earlier, and waited for Inez with the still, focused quality that characterized him in all things, except that anyone looking at him carefully could see that underneath the stillness he was simply, profoundly happy. Inez walked down the aisle in a dress of ivory cotton, fitted and practical as she was fitted and practical, but with small details of fine stitching that revealed the care she had put into it. She had made it herself in the evenings at the Oates house, having discovered over the preceding months that she had talent she had never had the domestic peace to develop, and the making of it had been its own particular pleasure. She looked at Edwin standing at the end of the aisle and felt everything very clearly. No fog, no numbness, no bracing against what came next. Just this. Just him. Just the clean, unambiguous joy of being exactly where she wanted to be. Father Ambrose said the words. They said the words. Edwin put a ring on her finger that he had bought from the jeweler who passed through on the monthly circuit, a simple band of gold that fit exactly right, and she put a ring on his, and Father Ambrose pronounced them husband and wife, and the gathered citizens of Red Rock Crossing celebrated with the particular enthusiasm of people who have spent a winter watching a love story unfold and are genuinely invested in the outcome. The reception was in the church hall, with Sull contributing an impressive quantity of food from the store's reserves, and someone producing 3 bottles of whiskey that appeared without obvious origin and were distributed with democratic generosity. The fiddle player from the bi-monthly socials played for 3 hours straight, and there was dancing, and Edwin Malone danced his wife through a Virginia reel and a schottish, and eventually a slow waltz that was not traditionally part of the Arizona Territory social repertoire, but which the fiddle player improvised with good will. And Inez danced with her husband and thought about the night they had first danced together at the wall of this same hall, both of them careful and guarded and standing apart from the world. And she thought about how much had changed and how right the change felt. They moved into the house. There was a house, a small adobe 2-bedroom structure on the edge of town that the county provided for its sheriff, and it had been Edwin's alone for 4 years. And it was not a big house or a grand house, but it had good bones and a large kitchen window that looked east toward the mountains. And Inez arrived in it with her carpetbag and her books and the small practical accumulations of her wagon journey, and within 2 weeks it felt like a home in a way that it had not been before. She hung curtains in the kitchen window. She arranged her books on a shelf that Edwin built for her one Saturday afternoon, measuring carefully and fitting the boards with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. She planted a small kitchen garden against the south-facing wall where the sun would warm the soil early, vegetables she knew, and a few herbs her mother had grown in Texas, the planting a kind of quiet continuity with what had been lost. He watched her make the house into something, and the watching gave him a pleasure that was different from any pleasure he had known before, deeper and quieter, the pleasure of something permanent settling into place. She wrote to the U.S. Marshal's office twice in the months following the investigation, following the progress of the Pratt case. The trial was in September, in the federal court in Abilene. She was not required to travel, as her documented evidence and sworn deposition were sufficient, but she followed the proceedings through the reports that came via the telegraph line that Red Rock Crossing had acquired the previous year. Douglas Pratt was convicted on 7 counts of fraud. He received a sentence of 8 years in the federal penitentiary. She read the telegram report at the kitchen table and sat with it for a long moment, feeling things that were complicated and various, relief and something like grief for the 2 years of work that had been weaponized against her, and the months of fear that had followed, and underneath all of it, a deep, steady satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the simple fact that the truth had been established and recorded, that the lie Pratt had built around her name had been taken apart. Edwin was home when she read it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and let her sit with it without rushing her toward any particular reaction. She said finally, "It's done. Yes, I don't know exactly what I feel. You don't have to know immediately." She looked up at him. "No, I suppose I don't." She folded the telegram carefully and set it down. "I feel free," she said. "Underneath everything else, I feel actually free for the first time in a very long time." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his, the same way she had across his desk in the sheriff's office on the day Cray delivered his report, and they sat like that for a while, which was enough. Summer in the territory was serious, the kind of heat that required respect and adjustment, the sun coming down from a white sky with an intensity that took some getting used to. Inez learned the rhythms of it, the early morning work before the heat peaked, the afternoon rest in the dimness of the adobe house that held the cool air long after the outside temperature rose, the evenings that came slow and golden and became, when the heat finally moderated, almost miraculous in their beauty. She was good at desert life. She had not known this before, had not known that she was the kind of person who adapted, who looked at difficult conditions with curiosity rather than resentment. Edwin teased her about it gently, her enthusiasm for the landscape that had initially struck her as inhospitable, and which she had come to regard with something close to love. She was 4 months into their marriage when she told him she thought she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, over the coffee that was still their time, the best time of the day. She had been moving carefully around the information for a week, turning it over, making sure of herself before she said it, which was characteristic. He went very still in the way he went still when something mattered enormously, and he was feeling it too fully to be casual about it. He said, "Are you certain?" "Fairly certain." "I'll go see Dr. Beckett today to confirm." He looked at her across the table, and his expression was the completely unguarded one, the one she had learned to recognize as the truth of him, and what was in it was something so luminous she felt it in her own chest like a struck match. He said, "Inez," she said, "I know." He got up from his chair and came around the table and sat in the chair beside her, and took both her hands in both of his, and they sat close together in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing to say that would be adequate, so they simply sat in the fullness of it. Dr. Beckett confirmed it that afternoon with the matter-of-fact competence of a frontier physician who had attended many births, and understood that the most useful thing he could do was be practical and reassuring in equal measure. He told her she was healthy, that everything appeared normal, that she should expect the child in late spring. Edwin told no one for 2 days, which in a town the size of Raydrock Crossing was approximately as long as a secret could survive in any case. On the 3rd day, Margaret Oates appeared at the door of the house with a basket of things she described as essentials, and Gareth Sull sent a basket of his own the following day, with a note of congratulations in his large, uneven handwriting. And the community of Raydrock Crossing responded to the news with the genuine pleasure of people who are invested in the well-being of people they have come to regard as their own. The winter of 1883 was milder than the winter before, which Inez considered a personal kindness on the part of the territory. She spent it in relative comfort, working reduced hours at Sull's store and putting more time into the house and the ongoing project of making it what she wanted it to be, which turned out to be considerable. She read through the winter, everything she could get, ordering books through the store's supply connections to Tucson, and receiving them with the particular delight of someone for whom a package of books from a distant city is a genuine event. She was deep in her 6th month when a package arrived containing a copy of Henry James's first novel and a volume of Mary Wollstonecraft that she had been trying to obtain for 2 years, and she sat down to open it at the kitchen table with so much obvious excitement that Edwin, watching from the doorway, laughed openly. She looked up. "What? You?" he said. "You look exactly like a child on Christmas morning." "These have been out of stock everywhere I've tried for months," she said, with perfect dignity. "This is a legitimate occasion." He crossed the kitchen and leaned down and kissed the top of her head and said, "I know. I'm glad you got them." And she could hear the smile in it even without seeing his face. They were, in the particular vocabulary of the territory, content. This was not a small thing. Contentment in frontier life was not the passive, settled feeling the word sometimes implied elsewhere. It was active, something earned and maintained daily against the difficulty of the conditions, and it lived in the house on the edge of Raydrock Crossing in the form of 2 intelligent people who had each survived considerable hardship and found, to their combined astonishment and gratitude, something real and sustaining in each other. Their son was born in late May of 1884 in the adobe house, with Dr. Beckett attending and Margaret Oates present in the organizational capacity she insisted upon as an essential element of the event. It was a long labor and an honest one, and when it was over and Inez was holding a small, indignant, red-faced boy who had arrived in the world with an expression of profound objection to the circumstances, she felt something shift in her that was fundamental, a reorganization of everything she had understood about herself. Edwin stood beside the bed with an expression she had never seen on him before, a complete dissolution of everything controlled and careful, just a man looking at something that had undone him entirely, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They named him Thomas for her father, and the name settled onto the baby with the rightness of a thing that was always going to be true. Thomas Malone grew up in Red Rock Crossing with the particular freedom of frontier children, which was considerable freedom, and no small number of associated cuts and scrapes and adventures that Inez catalogued with the systematic thoroughness she applied to accounts, which is to say she knew about all of them and was calm about most of them. He was a happy, curious child who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and a talent for getting into interesting situations that was entirely his own. Edwin Malone continued to be the sheriff of Red Rock Crossing, applying the same principled judgment he had always applied, neither more nor less. He had run for election twice since his initial appointment, and won both times with the comfortable margin of a man who has the community's genuine trust, which is different from and more valuable than mere popularity. He took cases as they came, and handled them with the thoroughness and the fairness that had become his professional signature. He also came home every evening to a house that was warm and lit and full of the particular music of a family, and this, he had long since decided, was the better and more important part of his life, the part that gave the other part its meaning. Inez continued working for Sull's General Store, finding ways to do so that accommodated first pregnancy, and then motherhood with the same practical creativity she brought to accounting problems. She had, over the years in Red Rock Crossing, also become an informal financial advisor to several of the small operations in the surrounding area, ranchers and miners who knew she was good with numbers and trusted her assessment, and who paid her fairly for it. She was, in the plain economic language of the territory, financially independent in her own right, which was something she valued not as a statement but as a fact, a thing that was true and good. She also wrote letters. She had started writing to the county commission in Callahan, Texas, in the year after the trial, not for herself, but about the mechanisms that had allowed what happened to her to happen. She wrote carefully and specifically, documenting the ways in which the local legal system had provided no meaningful protection to someone in her position, the ways in which a man of resources and connections could use the apparatus of law enforcement as a tool against someone without those advantages. She did not expect the letters to change the world. She expected them to go into a file somewhere and be read by someone and perhaps, eventually, contribute to something. 2 years after she began writing, she received a letter from a lawyer in Austin who was working on legislation around commercial fraud and who had read her correspondence and found it useful. He wrote to thank her and to ask follow-up questions. She answered thoroughly, as she answered everything. Edwin found her at the kitchen table one evening working on one of these letters, Thomas asleep in the next room, the house quiet and the desert outside the window cooling toward its evening temperature. He sat down across from her. "What's this one about?" she explained, with the same directness she had always brought to explaining things. He listened with his characteristic quality of attention, total and active. He said, "You're building something." "I'm trying to," she looked at him. "Does that seem impractical?" "No," he said immediately. "It seems entirely like you." She looked at him across the table, this man who had found her half frozen in a wagon on a December road and said, "Come inside," and had meant it in every sense that mattered. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." "I think about that first night sometimes," she said. "When you found me, I think about how close it came to going differently." She paused. "If you had left me in that wagon, if you had been a different kind of man." "I couldn't have left you," he said simply. "I know that now. I know that's who you are." She looked at her hands. "But I didn't know it then, and the gift of that night was not just the warmth. It was the first evidence that the world still had people in it who would act decently toward a stranger with no claim on their consideration." She looked up. "You gave me back the belief that things could be good, and everything that's come from that." She gestured at the room, the house, the life inside it. "All of it starts there." He was looking at her with that expression, the completely unguarded one, the one she had learned was the truth of him and which still moved her the same way it always had. He said, "You know what I think? Tell me." "I think," he said, "that you would have found your way back to that belief eventually because it's in your nature to. I think you were already on the way." He looked at her steadily. "I think I got lucky that a wagon stopped on a road near my town." She looked at him. "I think we both did." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held his. And the kitchen was warm, and Thomas was asleep in the next room, and the desert outside was doing its evening thing with the colors. The long orange light across the red rock formations that gave the town its name, and it was very simple and very good. 2 years after Thomas learned to walk with the determined, slightly listing gait of toddlers everywhere, Inez told Edwin she thought there was going to be another child. This time she told him in the evening, in the kitchen, while he was doing the dishes, which was a domestic habit of his that she had come to find quietly remarkable for the completeness with which he had integrated practical partnership into the routine of their life. He stood at the basin with the dish towel still in his hands and turned to look at her, and the expression that crossed his face was familiar and still, somehow surprising. The same luminous undoing that Thomas had first produced, visited again. He said, "When? December, Dr. Beckett thinks, December." He set down the dish towel. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her for a long moment, and she leaned into him and felt the steadiness of him, which was real and physical and present in the way that all the best things were. He said into her hair, "A December baby." She said, "The territory's winters have gotten kinder." He laughed, low and warm, and she felt it in her chest. Their daughter was born on a cold December night, the kind of cold that had teeth, and Edwin sat in the hallway of the adobe house, listening to the sounds from the bedroom where Dr. Beckett and Margaret Oates were working, and he felt things he did not have words for, vast and specific at the same time. When Margaret Oates opened the door and beckoned him in, he crossed the room to the bed where Inez lay, tired and bright-eyed and completely herself, holding a very small girl who had arrived in the world with considerably less objection than her brother had. Inez looked up at him and said, "She looks like you." He looked at the baby. He thought about saying that all newborns looked approximately like each other, which was true and which would have made Inez laugh. But he looked at the small face and he thought, actually, that she might be right, something in the set of the expression, something patient and watchful. He said, "What should we call her?" Inez said, "I've been thinking about that." She looked down at the baby. "I want to call her Clara for your mother." He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife for a long moment, this woman who had come to him cold and alone and carrying a secret and who had stayed and made everything in his life richer and larger and more than he had known it could be. He said, "That's a perfect name." She said, "I thought you might think so." He put his arm around her carefully, mindful of her tiredness, and she leaned against him, and he looked at the baby named Clara Malone, who was already asleep with the absolute confidence of something that has arrived exactly where it belongs. Thomas Malone, aged 4, was introduced to his sister the following morning with the diplomatic assistance of his mother, who explained the situation with the same clear directness she brought to everything. He regarded Clara with a serious, assessing expression that was so thoroughly his father's expression that both his parents had to work not to laugh, and then he said, with the considered certainty of someone who has reached a final verdict, "She can stay." Inez said, "I'm glad you've approved." Edwin, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with his coffee, did not manage not to laugh. The years in Reedrock Crossing had their share of difficulty, because all years do, and the territory provided its own particular catalog of hardship, drought and violence, and the ongoing injustices visited upon the Apache communities whose land the settlers occupied, the weight of which Inez acknowledged in her writing and Edwin in the applications of his law, imperfectly, because they were both honest people who understood that imperfect effort toward justice was better than no effort. And because some things could not be fixed from one small town in one man's jurisdiction, but could at least be not made worse. There were hard winters and a summer when the river ran low, and the garden failed entirely, and they ate from the store's reserves with careful accounting. There was a year when Edwin was shot in the shoulder during the arrest of a man who had made himself dangerous in the particular way of desperate people, and Inez sat by his bed for 3 nights running, while Dr. Beckett managed the infection that complicated the wound. And she sat with a fear she had not felt since the road, the cold, specific fear of losing something essential. And she prayed in the practical, direct way she prayed, which was a conversation with something she could not name but did not doubt. He recovered. He was not, in the long run, a man who was easily undone by the things that tried to undo him. It was one of the qualities she loved most in him, and sometimes found most maddening, depending on the situation. There were good years too, the better kind of years, the ones that look ordinary from outside but have a richness in them that is only visible to the people living them. Thomas grew from toddler to boy to young man, with the speed that seems impossible in retrospect, and inevitable in the living of it, developing his mother's love of books and his father's facility for being calm in difficult situations, and a talent for mathematics that made Inez look at him, sometimes, with a feeling of pure, astonished pride. Clara grew into a person who was funny and precise, and had a quality of focus that her parents recognized from themselves, and that manifested in her as a passion for drawing, filling notebooks with detailed sketches of the landscape, and the people of Red Rock Crossing with a skill that continued to develop, and that would, they suspected, take her somewhere beyond the territory one day. Edwin Malone was still the sheriff of Red Rock Crossing when Thomas was 15 and Clara was 11, and the territory was 4 years from becoming a state, and he was good at it in the way that good things get better with practice and sustained attention. The town had grown, had acquired a doctor's proper surgery and a proper hotel and a secondary school, and some of the roughness of its early character had smoothed, and he had grown with it without losing what had made him good at the job from the beginning. He came home one evening in the summer of 1895 to find Inez at the kitchen table with Thomas, both of them bent over something, and the concentration on both their faces was identical in a way that gave him a moment of the particular happiness of seeing people you love be most essentially themselves. He set his hat on the hook by the door and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and came to see what they were working on, and it turned out to be an accounting problem from Thomas's mathematics study that was, as far as Edwin could tell, considerably beyond his own ability to assist with, and he told them so honestly, which made Inez look up at him with a smile. She said, "You're home early." "Quiet day," he said. She said, "Clara is outside drawing the prickly pear. She says the flowers are the right color this year." He went out the back door and stood in the yard and watched his daughter, sitting cross-legged in the dirt in her second-best dress with her notebook on her knee, utterly absorbed in the translation of the cactus flowers onto the page. She did not notice him watching, and he did not disturb her, just stood for a moment with the evening coming in over the mountains and the smell of supper already on the air from the kitchen and the sound of Inez and Thomas talking numbers inside. He thought about a December night 13 years ago, about a wagon stopped on a road in the dark, about a woman he had not known looking up at him with frozen hands and careful eyes. He thought about everything that had started in that moment, the chain of it, unbroken, leading here to this yard, to this family, to this life. He thought about what he had said. "You are coming inside where it is warm." He had meant it practically, had meant it as the simple, urgent truth of the situation, had not had any way of knowing that it was also the beginning of the most important thing in his life. But that was the nature of important things. They often started small and plain as a hand on a shoulder, a lamp held up in the dark, a straightforward statement of what was necessary and what was true. Clara looked up and saw him standing in the yard. "Papa, look at the color I got right." He crossed the yard and looked at her notebook. The prickly pear flowers were precisely, vividly themselves on the page, their particular orange gold caught and held. "That's exactly right," he said. She beamed and went back to her work, and he went back inside. Inez was at the stove now, Thomas having retreated to his room with the mathematical problem, and she looked up when Edwin came in and said, "Supper in half an hour." "Good," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched her cook, which was something he still did after 13 years with the same pleasure, because she was interesting to watch in everything she did, the quality of attention she brought to all of it, the economy and precision of her movements. She looked over her shoulder at him. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that I am the luckiest man in the Arizona territory." She turned to look at him fully, spatula in hand, and her expression was the one he loved most, the soft, open, wondering one that appeared when she was not performing anything, just being precisely who she was. She said, "I'm inclined to argue on the grounds that I am considerably luckier," he said. "I'm prepared to debate that at length." She turned back to the stove and said, "After supper." He said, "After supper," and the kitchen was warm and the smell of food was in the air, and outside the window the mountains were doing the evening thing with the colors and Thomas was working on his mathematics, and Clara was in the yard with her notebook and the life they had built, from a wagon on a road and a lamp held up in the dark, and a simple, honest statement of warmth and welcome was entirely present around them, whole and good and real. Later that night, when supper was done and the children were in their rooms and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Inez and Edwin sat on the porch in the chairs he had built the previous summer, looking at the desert dark and the astonishing stars, with the particular comfort of people who have been sitting beside each other long enough that silence between them is its own kind of conversation. She said, "I got a letter from Austin today, the lawyer who's been working on the commercial fraud legislation. Good news. It passed. Not everything I proposed, but substantial portions of it." She said it quietly, without triumphalism, just stating a fact. "It'll make it harder for what happened to me to happen to someone else." He reached over and took her hand. She held his. She said, "I want you to know something. Tell me. I know I've thanked you before for what you did that first night, for finding me in the wagon and bringing me inside and believing me when it would have been easier not to." She looked out at the dark. "But I don't think I've said the whole of it. The whole of it is that you didn't just save me from the cold that night. You saved the future." She paused. "Thomas and Clara, the work, all of it, this." She squeezed his hand. "I don't know how to say thank you for that in any proportion to what it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were going to find your way. I told you that before. Maybe, but I found it with you." She turned to look at him in the dark. "That matters. That's the whole of it." He looked at her, and in the starlight she could see the expression she loved, completely without armor, the truth of him. He said, "You know what I've thought about, many times." "What?" "What my life would have been if I'd taken a different road that night. If I'd gone back to town by the south route instead of the east." He looked at the stars. "I would never have known what I was missing. I would have just been the sheriff, living alone in that house. And I would have thought it was enough because I wouldn't have known it wasn't." He shook his head slightly. 13 years, Inez. 13 years of knowing what enough actually feels like. And you and Thomas and Clara and this." He squeezed her hand. "I don't know how to say thank you for that either." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned over and put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat like that in the Arizona night with the stars overhead and the red rock formations dark against the sky and the desert doing its quiet, ancient thing all around them. She said into his shoulder, "I love you, Edwin Malone." He said into her hair, "I love you, Inez Chandler Malone." She said, "You used my full name." "I like your full name," he said. "I've liked it since the first time I used it." She laughed softly. "You used it to tell me you'd known the truth all along." "Yes," he said, "and you forgave me for it immediately." "I did," she agreed, "because it was the honest thing to do." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She closed her eyes. The night was quiet and the stars were brilliant, and the house behind them held their children sleeping soundly, and all the accumulated weight and richness of a life built together. In a town in the Arizona territory, at the end of the frontier century, by two people who had each carried their particular darkness through the world until they found in each other the warmth that makes darkness bearable. It had started with a lamp held up in the cold and a simple statement of what was necessary. It had become everything. And the everything was still here, still growing, still real, unfinished in the best possible way. The way of things that are alive and continuing and wholly, completely, permanently good.